Well, thank you very much. I wanted to start this morning by thanking Scott Goodwin for choosing me for this great honor. Scott, this is really the pinnacle of my career, and I'm both very proud and very humbled to be here. Today, our topic is 30 miles east of Samar, but before we get to that point, I want to start with, actually we jumped ahead already. Let's come back. I wanted to start by thanking all my partners in Miami. I have a fantastic group, a really wonderful group of people who have been nurturing and supportive, and I wanted to specifically mention those people who didn't get out here this week so I could be out here to do this. I also wanted to thank all of our former fellows and current fellows. They are part of a large extended family that we have in Miami, and they contribute greatly to our success. Most importantly, though, I have to thank my family. They're really the backbone for everything I do. It's my wife, Sue, my daughter, Lauren, my son, Nick, my son, Matt. Each of them is a lot smarter than I am. They're all in their own way much more successful than I am, and they've all taught me a whole lot more than I'll ever teach them, especially Sue, who's pretty good at pulling me out of muddy water and getting me onto dry ground on a fairly routine basis. Now, to be mentioned with this list of other daughter lectures is truly an honor. When you look at this list, you see a group of people who really forged the path for our society and put us in this great position we're in today. There's a group of innovators, leaders, educators, scientists, and most importantly, outstanding physicians. There's three people on that list that I wanted to highlight, and that's because there are three people who I had the privilege of working with in Miami. So we actually have 4 daughter lecturers that either worked as a partner currently or at one time in the past from our group, and I think that speaks volumes about the culture that we have in our group. So we're 50 years after the pioneering procedure that really gave birth to our specialty and transformed medicine. And where are we? Well, we're entering ankle deep in an ocean of change. In fact, I'd submit to you right now that in our lifetimes, in our career lifetimes, there's never been a time like there is now. And for many people, they've worked an entire career and never experienced what we're heading into. The Affordable Care Act, which was put into place in 2012, is the most broad-ranging, sweeping change in health care that many of us have ever seen in our lifetime. In fact, many of you weren't born, and most of us weren't in practice the last time there was anything like this, which was 1966, when Medicare first began to enroll patients. At the exact same time we're negotiating those changes, we're in the process of forming a brand new specialty, an interventional radiology specialty. This, I think, is critical and mandatory for our survival. But I show this slide because if you really look at the dates of when specialties were formed, it's been over 25 years since there's been a specialty formed like this. So this is a once-in-a-career, for many of us, a once-in-a-lifetime event that we're living through, along with the changes in health care. We also have some issues with our training programs, and we see that when we survey our trainees, 95% of our trainees want to learn peripheral arterial disease. Only 43 to 45% are. So we're heading in these times. We have changes we have to make in training. We have changes we have to make in the way our society is going to function. One of the main things we're seeing in global trends is that much of the research and development that was done here in the United States has moved offshore. Now, we as a society are so tightly linked to industry for our innovation that this is quite alarming to many of us. And at the same time, we see our income shrinking a bit, and we see this debt-to-income ratio expanding. So our trainees who are coming out may be making less and have more debt. So how do we navigate through this? Well, I would submit to you that these aren't problems, but they're challenges. And as you see in these photos of Charles' daughter, I think challenges can be overcome. Obstacles can be overcome when you have the right training, the right tools, and understand the clinical landscape around you. There's really no obstacle or challenge that we can't overcome. But how do we go about doing that? Well, many of us sit around in brainstorming sessions. Many of us sit around in strategic planning sessions. But sometimes a good way to try to figure out what to do is to look into the past and look at lessons learned. And there's millions and millions of lessons from history that we can look at where people were forced into unusual times and unusual circumstances they didn't mean to be in. And by doing different things, by getting out of the box, by changing what was convention, they transformed enormously disadvantaging situations into great advantages. And when I look back in history, I think of Jack Hewson. The story of Jack Hewson is what I'm going to tell you now, and that kind of, to me, epitomizes where we are today in many ways. Now, Jack was born in the mid-1920s into a relatively stable family, but the economic times were hard. He was a happy guy. He went to school, had a great family, worked to help support his family, as so many people did in those times. So you can imagine getting along great with his parents. The night at the dinner table, 3 days before he turned 18, when he announced to his family that he was joining the Navy. By Jack's description, his father stared silently into darkness, had no idea what to say. His mother, who was serving dinner, dropped the platter of food as it shattered all over the ground. But with great pride and lots of trepidation, like so many other parents did, they sent their son off to fight probably the single most unifying cause that the United States has ever had. And on a much less important scale in terms of life and loss, but in a similar way, we train our fellows. We're very happy for them. We're proud when they finish. But we send them out into practice into these times of change with similar types of anxiety on how they're going to manage and how they're going to make it. So Jack joined the Navy, went to his basic training, had never left his hometown in Queens, New York. And he's linked up with people from all walks of life, people he never would have met before. Much the same way when we come to our society meeting, we link up with lots of people that we forge bonds and friendships with through our life. Jack was assigned to a small ship. The ship was called the Samuel B. Roberts. Now I'm going to take a second and tell you about this. So this ship, this is not a destroyer. It's called a destroyer escort. It's a very small ship, not really made for any direct combat. These ships were conceived in the most inexpensive way possible. They were rapidly produced by this great war effort that was going on in the United States. And the purpose of this ship was really to serve as a bodyguard for bigger ships. Actually, if you thought about it in today's time, it really is nothing more than a motorcycle in a motorcade. No real strength or firepower. It had 2 guns, 5-inch diameter. As Jack and his men sailed from the Atlantic through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific, they continued to forge friendships and bonds that would last a lifetime, similar to the way many of you, in working through your society and working in your hospital, forge friendships and bonds that last a lifetime. So where were they heading? Well, they were heading to East Asia. And why was that? Let me take a second and tell you what was going on at the time. We had been at war for nearly 3 years. In the beginning of that war, we had suffered massive setbacks all through the Pacific. But gradually over the past year, the United States and its allies had slowly started to take land back. But it became very apparent that there was no way we could start a final offensive or we could ever win this war without having a landmass that we could use as a base in East Asia. Hawaii and the mainland of the United States were simply too far in the vast Pacific to try to do that. We needed a place for landing strips, a place to fuel ships, a place to rest men and recuperate, a place to put our supplies. And after much debate between Nimitz and MacArthur, it was decided that the Philippines would be liberated. Many of you may recall that just prior to 3 years ago, the United States had pulled out of the Philippines in shame when MacArthur made his great proclamation that I shall return. So now the United States is returning to the Philippines to liberate them. And in order to do this, in order to land hundreds of thousands of men off in the Philippines, it required huge naval support. And as it turns out, just east of the Philippines at that time, the United States had committed to forming one of the largest naval armadas ever assembled in world history. And they were going to be stationed off of the Philippines to support this landing. So Jack on the Samuel B. Roberts steamed to the Philippines, where his ship was linked up with a number of other small ships. Now these ships, as I told you, were produced inexpensively. Their hulls were very thin. In fact, they were referred to as tin cans. Their hulls were much, much thinner than the big destroyers and the big fighting ships. Their guns, as I told you, were only 5-inch caliber. They were referred to as pea shooters. So Jack was linked up with a number of other destroyer escorts and a group of small aircraft carriers. And their main goal was basically to provide land support for the troops that were landing. There was never a thought that they would be engaged in any type of battle. They were really an insignificant little bit in a giant machine of war that was stationed off the Philippines. So it was here, 30 miles east of Samar, on October 25th, 1944, where Jack and his crewmates found themselves. And on that morning, as they awoke, through the telescopes on the ship and through the binoculars and from some of the reconnaissance photos taken by the Hellcats that were flying reconnaissance, in front of them appeared a nightmarish image, a nightmarish vision of a large Japanese fleet on the horizon heading straight towards them. Well, how could that be? They were surrounded by a huge navy. So I'll take a second and tell you what had happened. If you look at this, this is the situation that was going on. The Americans were off the east coast of the Philippines. The Japanese recognized the value and the strategy of the Americans, and they actually devised a genius plan, an incredibly brilliant plan. In the upper part of that slide, you can see the Japanese sent a huge force of ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, heading straight towards the Americans, and then suddenly turned and they went back north. And that was a decoy force. And what happened there is Admiral Halsey, the great American admiral who was providing most of the support, took his entire fleet and chased this group. Now, by all naval convention and by the rules of engagement, this was a right move to do, to chase them into the blue water. And that term blue water comes up over and over. We talk about it in our society. We'll talk about it here. So Halsey takes most of his third fleet, and they chase this huge force. And as soon as they leave, they expose the whole northern operation. And steaming through the San Bernardino Straits, where you see number 2, is a much larger force of Japanese ships, the Central Force. This is composed of huge destroyers and battleships, and the only thing standing between them and MacArthur's men is this Taffy 3. So if we put this in a board schematic, you can see on your left, Taffy 3 has these 7 tin cans and these small aircraft carriers, half the size of a regular aircraft carrier, and they're engaged now with 23 giant warships, a huge armada of death and destruction. To give you an idea, if you went down to the Midway just a few hundred yards from here, you can see how big that is. The carriers that we had at that time were about half the size. Meanwhile, the Yamato, the largest naval ship to this date ever sailing in sea, was among this Japanese force. So as they saw this, they had 2 basic options. The small task force Taffy 3 could either engage in the most conventional way, follow the rules of engagement, probably experience near certain death and destruction, everyone be memorialized as great sailors, but in reality accomplish nothing. Or they could abandon their ways of the past and adapt to what's changing now and try to do anything they could to stave off this near certain defeat that was steaming right at them. So again, as I look at Halsey's men going north, I sometimes think of our society and I think the way we pursue blue water. And I wanted to just jump ahead 70 years and show you what the market is right now in the United States when we look at percentages of peripheral vascular interventions. And we see that the radiologists are doing about 30% of that. And I actually think that's really good. That's been stable for 5 or 6 years now. We've stopped the bleeding. If we look at the embolization market thrown on top of the PAD market and look at actual numbers of procedures performed a year and percentage growth, you see embolization on the top in purple. It's a blue water. It's doubled since 2002, actually tripled. And it is something we should pursue. We should always pursue the blue water. But should we expose our flank? Should we put ourselves in a position where we're not training people to do certain things? Should we put ourselves in a position where many of us in private practice stand to lose the turf we have because trainees are coming out ill-prepared to manage and deal with clinical problems? I think not. In addition, when we look at surveys, we see that a lot of our trainees are getting their vascular training from surgeons and cardiologists. A great stopgap measurement when we first started experiencing loss. But now it's become a routine type of event. It should have just lasted a few years. We should have adapted. We didn't. And now for many people, this is how they obtain their training. I would suggest again this is a huge mistake, especially as we start down the road of a new specialty. We need to train our own people, and it's doable. We can take a lot of this work and do it. We actually have data showing that our outcomes are better than other specialties. We should take advantage of that. So let's jump back 70 years. Here's Taffy 3 heading north. You can see in a defensive position. The carriers in the center, all the tin cans surrounding them, Jack on the Sammy B on the far west. What's heading at them? The large Japanese Central Force, 23 ships in their defensive position. So what happens here? All the great admirals are out at sea fighting the decoys, and decisions are now made on a local basis. And immediately at 7:10, we see that the American ships take a sharp right. So they act first. They don't wait. They're not defensive. Why do they take a sharp right? Well, they're not retreating. They take a sharp right and head into the circles that you see. Those are rain squalls, gale winds, huge rainstorms that are all through the South Pacific at this time of year. Immediately when they do that, the Japanese break formation. Already you can see fragmentation in the Japanese formation. So here you can see the Fanshawe Bay, the St. Lo, as they're heading in clear water, heading towards the rain clouds. Now why rain clouds? Why squalls? Well, look at the two islands on the screen left. As the rain squalls move in, those islands are completely obscure. Radar in those times wasn't very sophisticated, so visual contact was mandatory to engage in battle. So by heading into the rain clouds, an unconventional method, they were able to stave off the Japanese gunfire in the beginning. When we look at some of the things that are facing us unconventionally, look at right now the way hospitals have to meet or exceed federally mandated performance targets. Many of you may know this, but if those of you that don't, right now your hospital can be fined. They can be at risk from CMS payments, and it's not based just on clinical performance. All of a sudden, especially as we head into 2014 and 15, efficiency and outcomes are going to be measured. This is an excellent opportunity for us to think a little bit differently, not just do a lot of cases, but improve our outcomes, decrease hospital stays, improve efficiency. We as IRs can become great assets and great value to the healthcare systems that we provide care for. We have to realize how to do this. We're a nimble society. We can act quickly and swiftly. We have less invasive procedures. I think of all the specialties in medicine, we're probably more ideally suited to adapt than anybody else. Other specialties are already doing this. They're reimbursed from door to balloon time, ED arrival time to departure. We should be doing that. So at 7:10, let's jump back. Central Force. Now they're fragmented, and the large fleet of the largest battleships in the center have to stop firing their guns. They can't find the U.S. ships. What do the U.S. ships do when they're in cover of these rain clouds? Another very unconventional maneuver. They change directions again and head straight into the wind. These ships are much slower than the Japanese ships. Why would you do that? It seems almost suicidal to slow your ships down. Well, in fact, not. Now that they're facing into the wind, they can launch all their aircraft immediately, and in 25 minutes, all 6 aircraft carriers launch their planes and put them in the air. By flying into the wind, they do that by saving fuel, and they can get them up quicker. At the same time, the ships begin to make huge smoke screens. So, what is a smoke screen or making smoke in the Navy? That's when the ships create large dark clouds. And why would someone do that? Well, look at the same carriers I showed you. Look at the Gambier Bay here behind a smoke screen. Again, invisible to the enemy. The enemy needs to see us. So now the enemy is starting to fragment their formation. They have no idea how big the force is that they're chasing. They don't know if there's a small task force, which it was, or a much larger armada of ships. In the meantime, all the planes are cleared from deck. Now, these planes have been flying missions over the Philippines, and they're low on fuel and low on ammo. But again, the Japanese don't know that. So by putting these planes overhead, another strategic move, what happens? All guns up in the air. Standard naval maneuvers. You can't allow planes to fly over you. The planes start strafing these ships. What happens there? Much less firepower at the small Taffy task force. As the planes are strafing, most of these planes don't even have ammo. They're just running strafing runs. The enemy doesn't know that. They still have to actively defend themselves. When you read the accounts of the pilots, some of the pilots said their planes had no ammo. They were firing pistols out the window. One pilot even took his boots off and tried to throw them and hit someone on deck. Whatever works. True story. There's a picture of the Yamato as it's being strafed by our Hellcats. And here, behind our smoke screens, unable to find our ships to fire on. So, what do we jump ahead? Let's look at some things. Do you provide clinics for your patients? Do you provide the clinical care in your training? If you're a fellow coming out in practice, if you're young in practice, do you have a clinic? If we look specifically at vascular clinics, we see that over half of the trainees coming out in the past 2 years don't have that experience. I want to flip now to Miami and look at what we do down there. We have an office to see patients. It's been a mature office. It's been open since 1987. 83% of our fellows in practice, 83% of our fellows in practice have clinics up and running. And if you look at our fellows, 3/4 of them are in practices where vascular work is either growing or stable. Probably sounds different to a lot of other people who have seen a lot of work being lost. But we train people to accept and to deal with competition, and they're trained adequately so they can compete. It is doable. 7:30. Where's Central Force? You can see now that they're completely in a state of disarray, having a hard time finding the American ships. They're fragmented. We're strafing them. At this time, 2 of our ships, the Johnston and the Hull, are hit. But even hit, they don't retreat. Standard convention. They continue to fight forward. There's a picture of the Gambier Bay as it takes a direct hit on the teak wood deck. At 7:50, where are we? Another incredibly brilliant strategic move. We're now heading south, and the tin cans break away from the carriers in unison. Unlike, look at the Japanese, the red, complete disarray, not sure where to go, and this small group of ships launches a major offensive, completely befuddling and confusing the Japanese at this point. They're not sure how big the force is, so they get more defensive. In the meantime, we'll continue the strafing raids. Let's look up at some other strategies. We see medical imaging growing and growing. I suggest to you that that is not really where our future is going to be. I think we have to look at some strategies at potentially showing value in decreasing unnecessary imaging, decreasing unnecessary procedures, demonstrating our value to healthcare providers by doing indicated things, by limiting testing to only those who are appropriate. A convention that right now seems completely disaligned with the way we're reimbursed, but it's something that we have to do in the future. By 8:30, we see that there's the Sammy B, Jack and his men suffer a direct hit on their bow. The Hull, another tin can, at this point comes to a complete stop, mortally wounded. Some of our carriers have taken a hit, but this is an incredible photo of the St. Lo as at the exact time its hull is blown up. But what happens in the overview, if you look at this, we're nearly surrounded, but the Japanese are so disorganized and so confused with these different types of raids that they make the executive decision to retire and retreat. The battle's over in 2 hours. This tiny little task force able to retard and defeat one of the largest armadas the Japanese Navy's ever put together. As they leave, the Gambier Bay sinks. The last photo taken before the Samuel B. Roberts finds its home on the bottom of the ocean floor. And again, from the carriers, we can see the Japanese ships, wounded, smoking, sailing off to the north. So what really happened in this battle? The yellow, the American ships, they fight together. They're in unison. They use unconventional methods. They use rain squalls. They make smoke. They separate from their carriers and launch offensives against forces that they never should have thought about doing that. On the contrary, the Japanese are completely fragmented, disorganized, unable to mount any type of sustainable offensive. Sometimes when I look at our society today and I talk to a lot of you, I hear this talk, well, maybe this group should break off. Maybe we need our own specialty in one area or another area. We're not being represented well in our society. I would suggest to you that this fragmentation and splintering is a huge mistake. It's something we should not consider. We need to be a unified group. Under our society roof, our society is wide enough that we should be able to accommodate everyone's service line. We should be able to accommodate everyone's special needs. But by decreasing our manpower, by potentially decreasing our clout with industry, with the government, we weaken ourselves, we weaken all of us. We have to resist and retard that notion that we should splinter off. If we jump back to this chart I showed you earlier and throw embolization and PAD together, we'll see that we have a stable maintenance in the medical field of 33% of all types of endovascular procedures. And look at these growth rates. Look in our own service lines. Lower extremity angioplasty nationwide growing by 67%. Venous ablation 400%. Embolization 52%. But just getting this work and doing it isn't enough. We have to participate in trials. The only voice that's going to be heard by the government is data. We need to participate in publications. We have a fantastic journal, and we're also now publishing in some other nationally renowned journals on a more frequent basis. This needs to continue and grow. And finally, as a society, we need to accommodate different practice models. Right now, if you look at this chart, these are freestanding interventional centers, and their growth rate of between 300 and 350% in 3 of the largest states. I suggest to you, I submit to you that it may be that working with diagnostic radiologists in the future is not our future. It may be multi-specialty groups. It may be solo practices, especially as we have the strength from our new training program. I think that we as a society have to be open to all types of training, of all types of practice models. This is very important. So, Samuel Eliot Morrison, probably the greatest of all naval historians, said, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States shown more gallantry and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off of Samar." My hope for all of you is that in 20 or 30 years, somebody looks back and says, not our society, our membership, what they did in those early days as healthcare changed, as we formed a new specialty, as we treaded very treacherous waters, that we took different, non-conventional ways to better ourselves, and we put them in a position of prosperity and success in the future. To finish the story, Jack and his comrades are rescued out of the water after 48 hours, many succumbing to sharks. All the commanders of all the ships in Taffy 3 received the Navy Cross. And the story actually ends here in Convergence, our SIR theme. The story actually ends here in San Diego. If you go out the back of the convention center and walk down towards the large aircraft carrier, the Midway, just before you get there, you'll see a beautiful stone memorial to Taffy 3. It basically tells this whole story a lot shorter than I just did. But it's a moving memorial. I'd suggest all of you look at it. If you go around the point here in San Diego to Point Loma, about a 15-minute cab ride, at the Naval Cemetery, there's a wonderful, moving, large memorial to all these people who sacrificed to show us how change and non-conventional tactics can help us in the future. If you're interested in this story, there's lots that you can read about. One book that helped me the most was a book called For Crew and Country. The author, John Wukovich, is someone I contacted online when I started working on this project 6 months ago. And we struck up a friendship online, and then it became by phone, and we've spoken many, many times. He's provided me with great insight into the details of this battle and given me a lot of insight into all of Navy history. Although we've never met, actually, we have some things in common. We're going to meet in South Bend, Indiana on March 6th for the Notre Dame-Michigan game this year, so, which is true. The one thing John did for me, probably more valuable than anything else as I went through this, he introduced me to someone else who really made this battle seem lifelike, who really taught me what it was like to live through this type of change. And that person was Jack Hewson. Jack's 90 today, he lives in Seattle. When I first spoke to him over 6 months ago, there were 5 surviving members of the Sammy B. When I last spoke to him 2 weeks ago, there were 2 surviving members. Jack seemed very pleased and very thankful that his story, 70 years later, might be able to impact us and teach us about change and teach us about things we have to do. He was particularly pleased that that was occurring in a peacetime process. A couple of weeks ago when I spoke to him, the very last thing he told me is he wanted to wish all of you good luck. Thank you.